In the harsh Vermont wilderness, a pack of wolves surrounds a helpless golden retriever puppy. Just when all seems lost, James Cooper, a struggling farmer, risks his life to save the frightened animal. He brings it home to his modest farmhouse, treating its wounds with care and kindness. What James doesn't know is that this puppy belongs to Emily Rothschild, a reclusive billionaire who spent years searching for something real in a world of fake smiles and empty promises. As she desperately searches the countryside for her only true friend, will she find something even more precious than what she lost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost painted delicate patterns across the farmhouse windows as James Cooper pulled his grandfather's pocket watch from the bedside drawer. Its golden surface was dulled by decades of use, the hands frozen at 6:42, the exact moment. His grandfather had taken his last breath 3 years ago. James ran his thumb across its scratched crystal, a morning ritual as familiar as the rooster's crow. Outside, the Vermont winter painted everything in shades of grey and white. The old barn needed another coat of paint. The fence line wanted mending, and the tractor hadn't started in 2 days. But the watch reminded him of simpler times, when his grandfather's weathered hands guided his own through the rhythms of farm life. "A Cooper always rises with the sun," he'd say, pocket watch in hand. "Nature don't wait for the lazy." James slipped the watch into his jacket pocket and headed downstairs. The kitchen was cold. He'd turned the heat down again to save on bills. The stack of unopened envelopes on the table grew taller each week, most bearing the red stamp of final notices. He ignored them, just as he ignored the real estate agent's business card tucked beneath his coffee mug. The farm had been in the Cooper family for 3 generations. His grandfather had survived the Great Depression here. His father had modernized the operations in the 80s, and now James was watching it all slip away, one missed payment at a time. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, stepping out into the pre-dawn chill. The crunch of snow under his feet echoed across the silent fields. In the barn, the remaining dairy cows greeted him with soft moos, their breath visible in the cold air. 3 years ago, they'd had 30 head of cattle. Now, only 8 remained. "Morning, ladies," James murmured, beginning the familiar routine of feeding and milking. Each cow had a name given by his grandfather: Daisy, Belle, Rosie. They were more than livestock. They were the last connection to a legacy he was desperately trying to preserve. The morning passed in a blur of chores: fixing a broken water pipe, reinforcing the chicken coop against predators, checking the winter wheat fields buried under snow. By noon, his hands were chapped and red, despite his gloves, and his stomach reminded him he'd skipped breakfast again. Back in the kitchen, he made a simple lunch of soup and bread, his grandfather's watch sitting beside his bowl. The kitchen calendar caught his eye. Property taxes were due next week. The last milk check hadn't even covered the feed bill, let alone anything else. James reached for the realtor's card, turning it over in his hands. The woman had been persistent, talking about developers interested in the land, about opportunities and fresh starts. His grandfather would have shown her the door without a second thought, but his grandfather hadn't faced foreclosure. The watch seemed to stare at him accusingly. He could almost hear the old man's voice. "Land is the only thing worth having. Son, they ain't making any more of it." A distant howl drew his attention to the window. Wolves had been spotted in the area recently, driven down from the mountains by the harsh winter. Another problem to add to his growing list. He'd need to check the fences again, make sure the livestock was secure. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow as James walked the property line. His boots crunched through the crusty surface to softer powder beneath, each step a reminder of countless winters before. The pocket watch weighed heavy in his jacket, like the responsibility it represented. At the far corner of the property, he paused. Through the bare trees, He could see the lights of new houses in the distance, the encroaching suburbanization that had been creeping closer each year. His grandfather used to say they were sitting on a gold mine, but he'd meant the fertile soil, not real estate values. More howls echoed through the trees closer now. James tensed, scanning the tree line. The wolves were getting bolder, hunting closer to farms as their natural prey grew scarce. He quickened his pace back toward the barn, one hand instinctively touching the watch in his pocket. He might be losing the farm piece by piece, but he'd be damned if he lost any animals to predators. His grandfather had taught him that much. A farmer protects what's his, no matter what. Emily Rothschild sat in her study, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the pristine winter landscape of her estate. She opened the leather-bound journal on her desk, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. Max, her golden retriever puppy, dozed at her feet, occasionally twitching in his sleep. "Another charity gala declined," she wrote, her Mont Blanc pen gliding across the cream-colored paper. "Mother called again, 3 times this week, always the same conversation. When will I rejoin society? As if their version of society has anything real to offer." She paused, watching snowflakes dance outside the window. The isolation of her Vermont estate had become both refuge and prison. At 34, she was the sole heir to the Rothschild tech fortune, and according to Forbes, one of the wealthiest women under 40 in America. Not that she'd read the article. Her assistant had mentioned it during their weekly check-in. Max stirred, raising his head to look at her with those soulful brown eyes. Emily reached down to scratch behind his ears. "At least you don't care about my net worth, do you?" The puppy's tail thumped against the hardwood floor in response. She returned to her journal. 6 months since I left Silicon Valley. 6 months. Of peace, if you can call it that. The board thinks I'm having a breakdown. Mother thinks I'm becoming a hermit. Maybe they're both right, but after Thomas... Her hand trembled slightly. She'd met Thomas at a tech conference. Brilliant, charming, and apparently genuine. Until she'd overheard him on the phone with his friend, laughing about how he'd landed the golden ticket. The prenup papers were already drawn up when she'd called off the engagement. Max got up and brought her his favorite toy, a worn tennis ball. Emily smiled, closing the journal. "You're the only one who's never wanted anything from me, aren't you?" The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Rothschild, your mother is on line 1. Emily sighed. "Take a message, Claire. She says it's urgent. Something about the New Year's Eve charity ball." "It's always urgent." Emily picked up the tennis ball, tossing it across the room. Max bounded after it, his nails clicking on the floor. "Tell her I'm in a meeting." The house felt too big sometimes, its 14 rooms echoing with emptiness. Her father had bought it as a summer home years ago, back when the family still pretended to vacation together. Now it was her sanctuary, far from the artificial world she'd grown to despise. She moved to the window, watching the storm clouds gathering over the mountains. The local weather report had warned of heavy snow coming. Max returned with the ball, dropping it at her feet. "Want to go out before the storm hits?" The puppy's excited spinning answered her question. Emily pulled on her boots and coat, grabbing Max's leash from its hook. Outside, the air was sharp, with approaching snow. Max pulled ahead, his golden fur bright against the white landscape. Emily followed him down their usual path, past the manicured gardens now sleeping under winter blankets. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably another email from the foundation board. They were getting impatient with her absence from meetings, her reluctance to be the public face of the family's charitable giving. What they didn't understand was that she'd seen behind too many masks, witnessed too many fake smiles, and hidden agendas. Max barked at something in the distance, straining at his leash. "Easy, boy," Emily called, but her mind was elsewhere. She'd have to make a decision soon about the board position, about her role in the company, about everything her parents had planned for her since birth. The journal was her only confidant, pages filled with doubts she couldn't voice aloud. Sometimes she reread old entries, tracking the gradual dissolution of her faith in human nature. The last honest conversation she'd had was with her grandmother just before she passed away. "Money's a wall, dear," the old woman had said. "Most people never try to see past it to the person behind it." A cold wind whipped across the grounds. Carrying the first snowflakes, Max bounced through the deepening snow, still full of energy. Emily envied his simple joy, his uncomplicated approach to life. For him, happiness was a tennis ball and a warm bed. For her, happiness had become an increasingly abstract concept. She turned back toward the house as the storm drew closer, unaware that in less than 24 hours, everything in her carefully constructed solitude would change. James sat at his kitchen table, the weather-beaten farm ledger open before him. Red ink filled most of the columns, each entry a stark reminder of the farm's declining fortunes. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old window panes as the promised storm approached. He ran his finger down the latest column of figures, though he knew them by heart. Feed costs had doubled since last winter. Equipment repairs ate through what little cushion he'd managed to save. The milk production numbers kept dropping. His remaining cows were getting older, and he couldn't afford to replace them. A gust of wind howled through a crack in the window frame. The Weather Service had upgraded the storm warning to a severe alert, 8 to 12 inches expected overnight, with high winds and dangerous wind chills. James glanced at the clock, barely enough daylight left to prepare. In the barn, he double-checked the emergency generator. It hadn't been used since his father's time, but with the predicted temperatures, he couldn't risk the pipes freezing. The ancient machine sputtered to life after several attempts, belching exhaust into the cold air. "That's all we've got," he muttered, making a note in the ledger. They'd need fuel soon, another expense he couldn't really afford. The bank statement tucked between the ledger's pages showed a balance that made his stomach clench. Across the valley, dark clouds roiled. Over the mountains, the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and wet. James hurried to secure the last of the external equipment, his grandfather's watch a familiar weight in his pocket. The wolves would be hunting before the storm. He'd heard them again at dawn, closer than ever. In her study, Emily stared at her laptop screen, frowning at the latest email from the board. They'd scheduled an emergency meeting for next week, attendance strongly encouraged. The implied threat was clear. Show up or face consequences. Max whined at her feet, sensing her tension. Outside, the storm was building, transforming her manicured grounds into a wild landscape. The security system had already reported several downed branches along the perimeter fence. "Ms. Rothschild," Claire's voice came through the intercom. "The caretaker called. He's concerned about the storm and wants to know if he should stay overnight." Emily glanced at Max, who had moved to the window, watching the swirling snow with unusual intensity. "No, tell him to go home to his family. We'll be fine." She closed her laptop, unable to face any more passive-aggressive corporate correspondence. The journal on her desk tempted her, but she'd already filled 3 pages with her frustrations today. Instead, she walked to the window, standing beside Max. The puppy pressed his nose against the glass, tracking something Emily couldn't see. The ground security lights were starting to come on automatically, creating islands of brightness in the gathering gloom. The wind drove sheets of snow sideways, obscuring the view of the forest that bordered her property. A notification popped up on her phone, another storm update. Emergency services were advising residents to stay indoors, warning of potential power outages and dangerous conditions. Emily checked her emergency supplies out of habit, though she knew the house was well stocked. The generator would kick in automatically if needed. Max suddenly barked, sharp and alert. Emily followed his gaze, but saw only darkness and snow. The security lights cast long shadows across the white ground, playing tricks with perspective. Still, something about the puppy's behavior made her uneasy. She reached for his leash. "One quick walk before it gets worse, okay? Then we're staying in." The wind nearly knocked her back when she opened the door. Max bounded out eagerly, pulling her toward the garden path. The snow was already several inches deep, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes. They hadn't gone far when Emily heard it. A long, mournful howl carried on the wind. Max froze, ears perked forward. Emily tugged gently on his leash. "Come on, boy, let's go back." But the puppy resisted, straining toward the sound. His usual playful demeanor had vanished, replaced by an intense focus that Emily had never seen before. The howl came again, closer this time, accompanied by answering calls. "Max, no!" The leash slipped through her fingers as the puppy lunged. Forward suddenly, disappearing into the swirling snow. Emily ran after him, calling his name, but the wind snatched her voice away. The security lights grew distant behind her as she followed the sound of his barking into the gathering storm. Far across the valley, James Cooper latched the barn doors against the rising wind, unaware that both his life and Emily's were about to change forever. The wolves called to each other in the darkness, their howls mixing with the storm's fury as night descended on the Vermont wilderness. "Max!" Emily's voice was swallowed by the howling wind as she stumbled through deepening snow. The designer boots that had seemed practical inside the house now filled with icy powder, each step becoming more difficult. Her phone's flashlight carved a weak beam through the darkness, barely visible in the swirling storm. A flash of movement caught her eye, a golden blur in the distance. "Max, come!" But the puppy was beyond hearing or heeding, driven by some primal instinct she couldn't understand. His torn designer collar lay half buried in the snow, the expensive leather rendered useless by his desperate flight. Emily snatched up the collar, her fingers trembling. The emerald-studded tag her mother had insisted on, "A Rothschild dog must look the part, dear," now seemed ridiculous. What good was luxury when her only true friend was lost in a wilderness that didn't care about pedigree or wealth? The wolves howled again, their voices seeming to come from every direction. Emily spun around, disoriented. The security lights of her house had vanished behind the curtain of snow. Her phone's screen flickered, 15% battery remaining. The cold was seeping through her cashmere coat, expensive fabric, no match for the bitter Vermont winter. "Claire!" she shouted, hoping. Her assistant was still in the house, but she'd sent everyone home, hadn't she? Insisted on privacy, on independence, now that independence felt like a trap. Another bark echoed through the trees, fainter now. Emily plunged forward, branches whipping at her face. The perfectly maintained trails of her estate had disappeared, leaving only wilderness. Her foot caught on a hidden root, sending her sprawling into the snow. The fall knocked the breath from her lungs. She lay there for a moment, the cold seeping into her bones. Reality crashing down around her. She was alone, truly alone, in a storm that could kill her as easily as it could kill Max. All her wealth, all her careful isolation, meant nothing against nature's indifference. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "The board is very disappointed in your absence." Emily almost laughed at the absurdity. Let them be disappointed. Let them wonder. Right now, nothing mattered except finding Max. She forced herself to her feet, brushing snow from her clothes. The wind had shifted, driving ice crystals into her face like tiny needles. Max's paw prints were already filling with fresh snow, but she could still make out his trail leading toward the forest. The wolves called again, their howls closer. Emily's heart pounded. She'd read about wolves, of course, had donated to wolf conservation projects even. But reading about them from the safety of her study was very different from hearing their hunting cries in the dark. "Max!" she tried again, voice breaking. The puppy had come into her life 6 months ago, a gift to herself after the disaster with Thomas. The breeder had warned her that Goldens needed lots of attention, exercise, training. "They're not accessories," he'd said, eyeing her expensive clothes with judgment. But Max had become so much more than a pet. He was the one creature in her world who cared nothing for her name or her bank account, who greeted each day with pure joy, who cuddled close during her darkest moments of self-doubt, who made her huge, empty house feel, sometimes, almost like a home. A distant yelp snapped her attention back to the present. It sounded scared, pained. "Max!" Emily ran toward the sound, no longer caring about direction or safety. The trees grew thicker, branches grabbing at her clothes like skeletal hands. Her phone died with a final, quiet beep. The darkness pressed in, absolute, except for the faint gray glow of snow. The wind seemed to carry whispers now, playing tricks with her senses. Was that movement in the shadows? Were those eyes watching from the dark? Another yelp, cut short, then silence, broken only by the storm's fury. Emily stood frozen, straining, to hear anything over the pounding of her own heart. The wolves had gone quiet too, a silence more terrifying than their howls. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who or what she was praying to. "Please, not him, not Max." The storm raged on, indifferent to her pleas. Somewhere in the darkness, a pack of wolves pursued their prey, following ancient instincts that hadn't changed since long before the first Rothschild made their fortune. And somewhere, a frightened puppy ran through the night, leading both predator and rescuer toward a destiny none of them could imagine. James heard the yelp even through the storm's howling. He'd been checking the livestock one last time when the sound cut through the wind, desperate, afraid, and much too close to his property. His father's old rifle hung by the barn door, its wooden stock worn smooth by generations of careful handling. He grabbed the gun without hesitation, 3 shells in the magazine, plus 1 in his coat pocket. The weight felt familiar in his hands, though he hadn't fired it since last spring when coyotes threatened his chickens. This was different. The wolves had been getting bolder, and that cry hadn't come from a wild animal. The beam of his heavy-duty flashlight cut through the swirling snow. Years of working in all weather had taught him to keep proper gear handy. Waterproof boots, insulated coveralls, a hat that actually kept out the cold. He moved with purpose toward the tree line, following tracks that were already beginning to fill with fresh snow. Another yelp, closer now. James quickened his pace, guided by instinct and decades of knowing this land. The wolves' hunting calls had stopped, a bad sign. They went quiet just before the kill. He found the first wolf print near a fallen log, fresh, deep, big. This wasn't a small pack looking for easy prey. These were mature hunters, driven down from the mountains by hunger and desperation. The flashlight beam caught a flash of movement. Ahead, James raised the rifle, but it was only a branch swaying in the wind. His grandfather's watch ticked steadily in his pocket, a reminder of all the nights the old man had walked this same path, protecting what was his. A snarl cut through the darkness to his left. James swung around, light and rifle moving in tandem. Yellow eyes reflected the beam, one wolf then another circling. They were hunting him now too. The puppy's cry came again, weak but alive. Through the trees, James caught a glimpse of golden fur huddled against a rock face. The wolves had driven it into a corner, playing with their prey like cats with a mouse. James didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked through the storm like thunder. The wolves scattered, but he knew they wouldn't go far, not with prey so close. He ran forward, boots crunching through ice-crusted snow. The puppy lay trembling against the rocks, blood matting its fur where claws had grazed its flank. Its eyes were wide with terror, but something in them struck James. Intelligence, trust, a desperate plea for help. "Easy there," he murmured, keeping his voice low and calm like he did with frightened livestock. "I've got you." The wolf pack materialized from the shadows. 4 of them, big males by their size. Their fur was ragged, ribs showing through. The storm had made hunting difficult. They'd been tracking this puppy for a while, unwilling to let such an easy meal escape. The lead wolf lunged. James fired again, the shot going wide but forcing the animal back. He stepped in front of the puppy, making himself bigger, more threatening. The wolves snarled, saliva dripping from yellowed fangs. His father's voice echoed. In his memory, never turn your back on a predator. They respect strength, nothing else. The pack split, trying to flank him. James kept turning, rifle ready, flashlight beams sweeping the darkness. The puppy pressed against his legs, shivering. He could feel its heart racing, matching his own pounding pulse. Another lunge this time, from 2 directions. James fired his last shell, catching one wolf in the shoulder. It yelped and retreated, but the others grew bolder, sensing his vulnerability. The empty rifle was just a club now, and they knew it. The lead wolf gathered itself for the final attack. James could see the decision in its eyes. This prey was worth the risk. Time seemed to slow. His finger found the single shell in his pocket, muscle memory from countless hunting trips with his father taking over. The wolf sprang. James chambered the round in one smooth motion, brought the rifle up, and fired. The sound was lost in a sudden gust of wind, but the impact wasn't. The wolf crashed into the snow and lay still. The rest of the pack wavered, natural caution warring with desperate hunger. James stood his ground, empty rifle still pointed, bluffing with all his life was worth. For a long moment no one moved. Then, slowly, the wolves backed away. The storm swallowed them like ghosts, leaving only tracks in the bloody snow as proof. And they'd ever been there. James let out a shaky breath. The puppy whimpered, and he knelt beside it, hands gentle as he checked its wounds. The cuts were shallow. The wolves had been toying with it, confident in their kill. Another few minutes and... He pushed the thought away, gathering the trembling animal in his arms. "Let's get you somewhere warm," he murmured. The puppy pressed, its cold nose against his neck, as if understanding it was finally safe. The storm raged around them as James carried his rescued charge back toward the farmhouse. Behind them, the wolves' howls rose once more. A lament for lost prey, a reminder that nature's hunger was patient and endless. The farmhouse kitchen glowed with warm light as James gently set the puppy on his mother's old quilting table. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the handmade first aid kit. A wooden box his grandmother had painted with wildflowers, now filled with both veterinary and human medical supplies. Years of treating injured farm animals had taught him to be prepared. "Let's see what they did to you," he murmured, running careful hands over the trembling golden fur. The puppy watched him with intelligent brown eyes, no longer struggling, but not entirely trusting either. The wounds weren't as bad as he'd feared, several shallow cuts along the flank, a deeper graze on one leg, and a lot of matted blood that looked worse than it was. "You're lucky," James told his patient, pulling out antiseptic and gauze. "Those wolves weren't playing around." The puppy's fur was expensive-looking, well-groomed despite the ordeal. Someone's pet, clearly, and not from any of the local farms. He'd have to check around tomorrow, see if anyone was missing a golden retriever. As he cleaned the cuts, James found himself talking softly, the way he did with nervous livestock. "My grandmother made this kit when I was 10, said every farmer needs to know basic doctoring. Started me out patching up chickens and barn cats." The puppy's tail thumped weakly against the table, responding to his gentle voice. It was young, maybe 6 or 7 months old, and despite its obvious breeding, there was something endearingly earnest about its face. "Had a dog myself growing up. Old mutt named Rusty. Used to follow me and Grandpa around the farm all day." James applied antibiotic ointment to the deeper cut, earning a small whimper. Easy now, almost done. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the windows. The puppy startled at a particularly loud gust, pressing against James's hand. Without thinking, he stroked its head, offering comfort. "Storm's not getting in here. You're safe." The first aid kit held an assortment of bandages, some meant for humans, others for various farm animals. James selected the most appropriate ones, working with the practiced efficiency of someone used to treating injuries alone. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. A farmer's got to be doctor, mechanic, and weatherman, all rolled into one. As he wrapped the last bandage, the puppy surprised him by licking his hand. The simple gesture of trust made something catch in his throat. How long had it been since he'd had any company besides the livestock? The farm's isolation had seemed practical before, but suddenly the quiet felt heavier than usual. "Hungry?" he asked, securing the bandage. The puppy's ears perked up at the word. James couldn't help smiling. "Thought so. Let's see what we've got." He found some leftover roast beef in the fridge. Nothing fancy, but the puppy didn't seem to mind. It ate carefully despite its obvious hunger, showing manners that spoke of good training. Another piece of evidence that this was someone's beloved pet. "Going to need a name while you're here," James mused, watching it eat. "Can't just keep calling you puppy?" The dog looked up at him, head tilted questioningly. Something about its expression reminded him of his grandfather's patient wisdom. The wind howled outside, and the puppy pressed against James's leg. Without thinking, he reached down to scratch behind its ears. The simple contact felt right somehow, as if the animal's presence was filling a space he hadn't realized was empty. "You need rest," he told it finally, "and I've got to check the generator before this storm gets worse." But when he moved toward the door, the puppy tried to follow, limping slightly. Those brown eyes held such trust now, such certainty that where James went was where safety lay. He hesitated, then grabbed his grandmother's old blanket from the living room chair. "All right, come on then, but you stay close." The puppy's tail wagged as James made a bed near the wood stove, tucking the blanket into a cozy nest. Before heading out to check the generator, James found himself pausing in the doorway, looking back at his unexpected guest. The puppy had already curled up in the blanket, but its eyes remained on him, alert and somehow knowing. "I'll be right back," he promised, and meant it. Something had shifted in the old farmhouse's atmosphere. The familiar rooms felt different now, warmer somehow, as if the simple presence of this rescued creature had changed more than just the evening's routine. James patted his pocket, feeling his grandfather's watch. The old man had always said every life saved was a debt owed by the universe. Looking at the trusting animal by his wood stove, James wondered what this particular debt might bring. The local newspaper lay open on Emily's desk, its headline stark against the morning light: "Winter storm claims 3 lives in Vermont counties." Her hands trembled as she scanned the article, searching for any mention of injured animals, of wolves of hope. Behind her, Claire worked the phones, coordinating with local shelters and veterinary clinics. "I've contacted every shelter within 50 miles, Claire reported, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. She'd worked for Emily for 5 years, long enough to understand that Max wasn't just a pet. The storm knocked out power in most areas, but they'll call as soon as— "Expand the search," Emily interrupted. 100 miles, 200, whatever it takes. She pushed the newspaper aside, unable to look at its grim statistics any longer. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape and a hollow ache in her chest. Across the valley, James stood at his kitchen window, watching the rescued puppy explore the snow-covered yard. The morning sun turned the fresh powder into a sea of diamonds, making him squint. The dog's bandages stood out against its golden fur, but its movements were stronger now, more confident. "Stay where I can see you," he called, and remarkably, the puppy obeyed, keeping within the boundary of his voice. James smiled despite himself. In just one night, the animal had learned to trust him completely, as if being saved had forged an unbreakable bond. The morning paper caught his eye as he poured his coffee. A small article on page 3 detailed recent wolf sightings in the area, warnings to protect livestock and pets. James thought of the empty rifle by his door, of how close last night's encounter had come to ending differently. The puppy barked outside, not afraid, just announcing a discovery. James looked up to see it pawing playfully at a snowdrift, all trauma from the previous night apparently forgotten. Youth and resilience, he thought, remembering his grandfather's words about how quickly animals could heal when given care and safety. In her mansion, Emily prepared for another day of searching. She pulled on practical clothes this time. No more designer boots and cashmere coats. The local search and rescue team had been sympathetic but clear. The storm had caused too many human emergencies for them to prioritize a lost pet. "Miss Rothschild?" Claire appeared in the doorway. "The newspaper editor is on line 1 about the reward announcement." Emily nodded, picking up the phone. Money might not buy happiness, but it could buy attention, resources, eyes looking everywhere for a flash of golden fur in the snow. The editor was eager to help, mentioning something about human interest and local color. Emily didn't care about his motivations, only his reach. Meanwhile, James checked the bandages on his patient, pleased to find the wounds already beginning to heal. The puppy stood patiently for his examination, tail wagging gently, brown eyes following his every move. It had slept through the night, by the wood stove, only whimpering once when a particularly strong gust rattled the windows. "You're doing well," he told it, offering a small treat. The dog took it carefully from his fingers, its manners impeccable even in exile. James had checked with his nearest neighbors by phone, but no one recognized his description. The storm had made driving impossible, so a wider search would have to wait. The puppy followed him through his morning chores, watching with interest as he fed the cattle and checked their water. It seemed fascinated by the chickens, but made no aggressive moves, just observed from a respectful distance. Well trained, James thought again. Someone had invested time and love in this dog. Back in her study, Emily stared at the growing stack of missing pet posters Claire had designed. Max's photo seemed to stare back at her, happy, innocent, trusting. The reward amount made Claire's eyes widen, but Emily would have offered 10 times more if she thought it would help. "The first batch of posters will go out today," Claire said softly. "As soon as the roads are cleared." Emily nodded, unable to speak. The house felt wrong without Max's presence, too quiet, too empty, too much like the gilded cage it had been before he came into her life. She picked up his favorite tennis ball from her desk, its worn surface smooth against her palm. Down in the valley, James watched the puppy roll in the snow, playing with an old rope toy he'd found in the barn. Its joy was infectious, making him smile more in one morning than he had in months. The farm felt different somehow, as if the dog's presence had awakened something long dormant. He pulled out his grandfather's watch, checking the time. The roads would be cleared soon, and then he'd have to start looking for the dog's owner. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. One night, and already the old house felt more like a home than it had in years. Emily's Range Rover crawled along the snow-packed road, her eyes scanning every fence line, every barn, every potential shelter where Max might have found refuge. The missing dog posters in her passenger seat shifted with each turn, their bold reward headlines catching the morning light. 3 days of searching had left her exhausted, hope wearing thin as winter sunlight. The road curved around a small valley, revealing a weathered farmhouse and barn set back from the road. Something about the property made her slow down. Perhaps the thin curl of wood smoke from the chimney, or the way the morning sun caught the frost on the fence posts. A flash of movement near the barn caught her eye. Golden fur in the sunlight. Her heart stopped. Inside the farmhouse, James was just finishing his coffee when he heard the crunch of tires on snow. The puppy, dozing by the wood stove, lifted its head alertly. 3 peaceful days had settled them into a comfortable routine. Morning chores together, quiet afternoons by the fire, nights spent sharing the warmth of the old house. He looked out the window to see an expensive SUV pulling into his drive, its glossy black paint incongruous against the working vehicles of his farm. The puppy was already at the door, tail wagging with unexpected enthusiasm. "Guess we knew this was coming," James murmured, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. He opened the door just as a woman emerged from the SUV, her designer, in coat and boots, marking her as distinctly out of place in his world. Emily's hands shook as she stepped out of the car. She'd imagined this moment 100 times, finding Max, holding him again, knowing he was safe, but seeing him standing in that doorway, beside a tall, weathered man she'd never met, made her stomach clench with unexpected anxiety. "Max?" Her voice caught on the name. The puppy, her puppy, bounded toward her through the snow, all wiggling enthusiasm and joyful barks. Emily fell to her knees, heedless of the wet snow soaking into her clothes, as Max covered her face with eager kisses. James watched the reunion from his doorway, his throat tight. The woman was crying, holding the puppy close, murmuring words he couldn't hear. His grandmother's blanket still lay by his wood stove, the rope toy scattered in the yard. Small. Markers of 3 days that had changed something in him he hadn't known needed changing. "Thank you," Emily managed finally, looking up at him. "I've been searching everywhere." She noticed the bandages on Max's flank, anxiety flickering across her face. "He's hurt." "Wolves," James said simply. "Found him in the storm. Patched him up best I could." Emily's eyes widened. "Wolves?" She held Max tighter, finally seeing the full story in those bandages, in this stranger's quiet presence, in her puppy's unharmed state, despite what must have been a terrifying ordeal. "You saved him." The question came out smaller than she intended. James nodded, uncomfortable with the way she was looking at him, like he was some kind of hero, rather than just a farmer who'd done what needed doing. Anyone would have. "No," Emily said softly, remembering all the people who'd dismissed her search, who'd told her it was just a dog, who'd suggested she simply buy another one. "Not anyone." She stood, keeping one hand on Max's head. Up close, she could see the character in this man's face. Lines carved by sun and wind, eyes that held a quiet kind of strength, nothing like the polished, calculating faces she was used to in her world. "I'm Emily," she said, then hesitated. The Rothschild name usually changed everything, made people see dollar signs instead of her. Emily Rothschild. Recognition flickered in James's eyes. He'd seen the reward posters in town, impossible to miss with their striking photos and impressive sum. But his expression didn't change, didn't shift into the familiar dance of calculation and opportunity. She'd grown to hate. "James Cooper," he replied simply. "Would you like to come in? Hear what happened?" Max was already trotting back to the house, pausing to look between them expectantly. Two worlds were about to collide in that farmhouse kitchen, neither of them quite ready for what that would mean. Emily nodded, following her puppy's lead. The missing dog posters rustled in her car, forgotten, as the morning sun painted everything in shades of possibility. The farmhouse kitchen held its breath as Emily stepped inside. Steam rose from 2 coffee cups on the worn table. James had poured a second one automatically, a gesture that spoke of innate hospitality. Max settled comfortably between their chairs, clearly at home in both worlds. "He's quite fond of that spot by the wood stove," James said, watching as Emily took in the room. Her eyes lingered on his grandmother's blanket still folded nearby, the old quilting table where he'd treated Max's wounds, the humble details of a life lived simply. "It looks like he's been well cared for," Emily said softly, noting the fresh bandages, the careful attention evident in every detail. A shared cup of coffee sat between them, an unexpectedly intimate bridge between their worlds. "He's a good dog," James replied, his voice holding warmth that surprised them both. "Smart, gentle with the livestock. Learned the farm routine faster than some hired hands I've had." Emily watched Max rest his head on James's knee, tail thumping gently against the floor. The gesture was so natural, so comfortable, that something twisted in her chest. "Tell me about the wolves," she said, needing to understand what this stranger had done for her only true friend. James described that night. The storm, the howls, the desperate race through the snow. He spoke simply, without drama or expectation, as if saving a life was just something one did, like feeding livestock or mending fences. "I had 3 shells in the rifle," he explained, hands curved around his coffee cup, "plus 1 in my pocket." Almost wasn't enough. Emily's fingers tightened. On her own cup, imagining the scene. "You could have been killed. Couldn't leave him out there." James shrugged, but his eyes met hers with unexpected intensity. "Some things you do because they need doing, that's all." The morning light filtered through old window panes, casting gentle shadows across the kitchen. Emily found herself studying, James's face, the quiet strength there, the complete lack of pretense that she'd grown so unused to in her world of corporate masks and social manipulations. "The reward," she started, but James was already shaking his head. "Keep it," he said firmly. "Wasn't why I helped." "I know," Emily replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "That's exactly why I want to—" "Miss Rothschild," James interrupted gently. "Emily, the paper said you're offering $50,000. That's more money than this farm makes in 2 years, but it wouldn't be right." Max looked between them, sensing the tension. Emily struggled to understand. Not James's refusal, but her own reaction to it. When was the last time someone had turned down her money, had looked at her and seen just her? "Then let me do something," she insisted. "You saved his life. You cared for him, gave him shelter. And he gave me something back," James said, quietly. 3 days of company. Purpose beyond the usual routine. Sometimes a gift is worth more than money. Emily watched as he absently stroked Max's head, the gesture so natural it made her throat tight. This man, this stranger who lived in a world so different from hers, had given her puppy exactly what she'd always tried to provide. Genuine care, untainted by ulterior motives. "You understand him," she said softly. "Most people just see. An expensive pet, a status symbol, but you see him. Same way he sees me," James replied. "Just a farmer with a warm fire and some leftover roast beef. No more, no less." Their eyes met over the coffee cups, and something shifted in the morning. A recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits trapped in different cages. Her gilded one of wealth, his weathered one of obligation to the land. "Tell me about the farm," Emily found herself saying. "Max clearly loves it here. I'd like to understand why." James hesitated, then nodded. As he began to speak about his grandfather's legacy, about the rhythms of farm life and the satisfaction of working with his hands, Emily felt something inside her unlock. Here, in this sun-warmed kitchen, with its peeling wallpaper and honest. "Coffee?" She was just a woman listening to a man's story, with a dog contentedly stretched between them. Max sighed happily, settling in as morning stretched toward noon. He knew, with a dog's simple wisdom, that something important was happening. 2 humans learning to see past the barriers they'd built around their hearts, brought together by one stormy night and his own blind trust in the goodness of both. The thank you card sat unopened on James's kitchen table, its cream-colored envelope stark against the worn wood. His name was written in elegant script, the kind of handwriting that spoke of private schools and privilege. He'd found it in his mailbox that morning, a week after Max's departure, and hadn't yet found the courage to open it. The house felt different now, emptier. The space by the wood stove where his grandmother's blanket had made a dog bed now seemed to mock him with its emptiness. Even the morning routine had changed. No eager face waiting by the door, no playful barks greeting the chickens, no warm presence following him through his chores. James picked up the envelope, turning it over in his calloused hands. The return. Address was simply E. Rothschild, with a P.O. box number. No mention of the mansion he'd glimpsed through the trees while helping Emily load Max into her Range Rover that day. The memory was still fresh. Max's confused whine as Emily attached his new leather leash, the puppy looking between them as if unable to understand why he couldn't have both. Emily's own face had been complicated, gratitude warring with something else as she watched James kneel to say goodbye. "You're a good boy," he'd told Max quietly, receiving one last enthusiastic face-licking. "Mind your manners now." Emily had tried one final time to offer compensation, but James had stood firm. How could you put a price on 3 days that had reminded him what it meant to care for something beyond obligation? How could you quantify the way Max's presence had transformed his solitary existence into something warmer, more purposeful? The thank you card seemed to demand his attention. With a sigh, James opened it carefully, something his grandfather had taught him about treating all things with respect, regardless of their origin. Inside, Emily's handwriting flowed across the expensive paper. Dear James, words seem inadequate to express my gratitude. You didn't just save Max's life, you gave him exactly what he needed when he needed it most. The way you cared for him, understood him, it's shown me something I didn't expect to find in this world anymore. Max misses the farm. He spends hours looking toward the valley, and the rope toy you gave him has become his favorite possession. Sometimes I think he taught me more in those 3 days of separation than I've learned in years of running from genuine connections. I know you won't accept payment, and I respect that more than I can say, but I hope you'll accept my friendship, as unexpected as this all has been. With deepest gratitude, Emily. James set the card down, his throat tight. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the dust motes in its beam just as it had the day he'd watched Emily's car disappear down his drive. Max's face had been pressed against the back window, those soulful brown eyes fixed on him until the last possible moment. He'd thought about them often over the past week, the unlikely pair from another world who had briefly intersected with his life. Emily's obvious wealth hadn't changed the genuine care she showed for Max, or the way she'd listened to his stories about the farm with real interest. There had been moments, sitting in his kitchen that morning, when class barriers had dissolved into something simpler, more authentic. The farm's routine continued unchanged on the surface. James still rose before dawn, still tended his animals, still fought his quiet battle against financial pressure and encroaching development. But something had shifted inside him, as if Max's brief presence had awakened him to the emptiness he'd been ignoring. He picked up the card again, rereading Emily's words. The offer of friendship seemed sincere, free from the usual complications of wealth and status. Yet it also carried an undercurrent of possibility that both attracted and terrified him. Outside, the winter wind carried the first hints of approaching spring. Soon the maple trees would begin their sweet surrender, the fields would need preparing, and life would surge forward with its relentless demands. But for now, James sat in his quiet kitchen, holding a bridge between two worlds in the form of a simple thank you card, wondering why his carefully constructed solitude no longer felt like enough. The farm foreclosure notice crackled in Emily's hands as she read it again, hardly believing what she was seeing. She'd come across it purely by accident, dropped from a stack of papers while visiting the local bank to discuss community investment. Opportunities. Her family's wealth meant doors opened easily, information flowed freely, and people spoke perhaps more candidly than they should. The Cooper farm? She'd asked the bank manager, keeping her voice casual. I thought it had been in the family for generations. Shame, really, the manager had replied, not noticing how still she'd become. Good man, James Cooper, but farming's a tough business these days. We've got developers interested in the land. Could be a nice little tech campus. Bring some jobs to the area. Now, sitting in her study with Max dozing at her feet, Emily felt the weight of knowledge she hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. The numbers on the notice were stark. 3 months behind on payments, property taxes overdue, equipment loans in default. The farm wasn't just struggling, it was drowning. Max lifted his head, sensing her distress. The rope toy from James's farm lay beside him, worn from constant use. Emily reached down to scratch his ears, remembering the quiet dignity of that farmhouse kitchen, the way James had refused her reward with such gentle firmness. "What would you do, boy?" she murmured. Max's tail thumped against the floor at the sound of her voice. "Your friend James won't take help, but he saved your life. Doesn't that create some kind of obligation?" She pulled up the bank's information on her laptop. The total amount needed to save the farm was significant, but trivial to someone of her wealth. A few clicks, a transfer of funds, and she could ensure James never had to worry about foreclosure again. The temptation was immense, but she remembered the look in his eyes when he'd refused her reward. That quiet pride, that independence that was as much a part of him as the land he worked. Simply paying off his debts would be worse than offering him money for saving Max. It would be a confirmation of everything he probably feared about wealth and its power. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Rothschild, the investment committee is waiting for your decision about the new tech development properties." Emily stared at the foreclosure notice, an idea forming. "Claire, cancel the committee meeting and get me everything you can find about agricultural investment funds, particularly any focusing on sustainable family farms." "Of course." A pause. "May I ask why?" "Because sometimes the best investments aren't about maximum return," Emily replied, watching Max nose at his farm toy. "Sometimes they're about preserving something valuable before it's lost forever." She picked up her phone, then set it down again. What could she say to James? "I accidentally discovered you're about to lose everything you love, and I want to help, but I know you won't let me." The words sounded condescending even in her head. Max whined softly, pressing against her leg. His wounds from the wolf attack had healed completely, leaving only faint scars beneath his fur. But the memory of what James had done, risking his life without hesitation to save a stranger's pet, remained vivid. The foreclosure notice seemed to burn in her hands. 3 generations of Cooper farmers had worked that land, survived depression and drought, adapted and endured. And now it might all end because modern economics had no room for small family farms, no matter how well run or loved they might be. Emily walked to her window, looking out over her manicured grounds toward the valley where James's farm lay. The distance between their worlds had never felt greater, yet somehow that only strengthened her resolve. There had to be a way to help that wouldn't wound his pride or cheapen what he'd done for Max. The problem wasn't just about money. It was about bridging 2 different ways of seeing the world. James valued independence, hard work, and the legacy of his land. She had to find a solution that respected those values while still offering real help. Max appeared beside her at the window, tail wagging as he gazed toward the farm. Perhaps he understood better than either of them. Sometimes love meant finding a way to help, even when pride and circumstance seemed to make it impossible. The business contract lay untouched between them on James's kitchen table, its crisp legal pages a stark contrast to the worn wooden surface. Emily had presented it with careful words, explaining her proposed agricultural investment fund designed to preserve family farms. But James hadn't reached for it yet. He sat still, his grandfather's pocket watch heavy in his hand, its familiar weight anchoring him as his world tilted on its axis. "It's not charity," Emily said softly, watching his face. "The fund would be investing in multiple family farms across Vermont. Yours would simply be the first. All existing owners maintain operational control. We're just—" She hesitated. "Providing breathing room." "Breathing room," James repeated, his voice quiet. Outside, the February wind rattled the windows, as if nature itself was unsettled by this collision of worlds. "And you just happened to choose my farm first?" Emily met his eyes steadily. "I chose your farm because I've seen how you work it, how you care for it, what it means to you." She glanced down at Max, who lay between their chairs as he had that first morning. "And yes, because I owe you. You don't owe me anything." James's fingers traced the worn edges of his grandfather's watch. "Max needed help. I helped. It's that simple." "But it's not simple, is it?" Emily leaned forward. "Nothing about this is simple. You're about to lose your farm, James. 3 generations of your family's work, gone because modern economics doesn't value what you do." James stiffened. "How did you—" "The bank manager. He was eager to share information with a potential tech park investor." She saw the flash of anger in his eyes and hurried on. "I wasn't looking for it, but once I knew, I couldn't just walk away. So instead you created an entire investment fund?" There was something new in his voice. Disbelief tinged with a hint of admiration, quickly suppressed. "I have resources," Emily said simply, "and contrary to what you might think, I understand about legacy, about responsibility to something bigger than yourself." James finally reached for the contract, but only to turn to the last page. The numbers there made his throat tight. Enough to clear the bank debt, modernize equipment, maybe even restore the North Field irrigation. Why? The question came out rougher than he intended. Emily was quiet for a moment, absently stroking Max's head. Because when you found him in that storm, you didn't see a rich woman's pet worth a $50,000 reward. You saw a living creature that needed help. You risked your life without calculating the benefit. She met his eyes. Maybe I want to help without calculating too. It's different, James protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Emily gestured to the farm beyond the windows. This land, these animals, they're living things too. They need help. And unlike Max, they can't be saved by one night's courage. They need a different kind of rescue. James stood abruptly, moving to the window. The morning sun painted his fields in shades of promise and regret. How many mornings had he watched his grandfather stand in this same spot, planning the day's work? How many times had his father pointed out the boundaries of their land with quiet pride? I can't just take your money, he said finally. You're not taking anything. Emily's voice was gentle but firm. You're participating in a legitimate investment program, one that values sustainable agriculture and family farming traditions. She paused. One that believes some things are worth preserving. Max got up and padded to James's side, pressing against his leg the way he had during those 3 days they'd shared. The gesture carried echoes of trust, of simple affection, uncomplicated by pride or position. The contract requires quarterly reports, Emily continued. Regular assessments of agricultural productivity, environmental impact studies. It's not a gift, James. It's a partnership. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to examine. James turned back to face her, seeing past the expensive clothes and cultivated manner to something else, a woman trying in her own way to save something she valued. I'll need time, he said finally, to read it over. Think about it. Emily nodded, rising to leave. At the door she paused. Max misses the farm, she said quietly. He's not the only one. After she left, James sat for a long time with the contract, his grandfather's watch, and the weight of choices he never expected to face. Outside, the winter sun continued its arc across the sky, illuminating a landscape that had suddenly become more complicated and perhaps more hopeful than it had been at dawn. James found the old family photo album while preparing for the approaching storm. It had been tucked away in a kitchen drawer, its leather binding cracked with age, pages yellowed but carefully preserved. His grandfather smiled up from the first photo, standing proud beside a much younger version of the barn. The weather service was predicting another severe system, worse than the one that had brought Max to his door. As James checked his emergency supplies, the album kept drawing his attention, as if the past was reaching out with particular urgency tonight. The sound of spinning tires pulled him from his thoughts. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the shape of a vehicle stuck at the bottom of his drive. His heart jumped when he recognized Emily's Range Rover. Max's excited bark carried through the storm as James pulled on his coat. By the time he reached them, Emily was outside, looking frustratedly at her buried wheels. Snow had already dusted her dark hair, making her seem softer somehow, more vulnerable than the polished businesswoman who'd presented him with the contract last week. I was bringing you copies of the environmental impact studies, she explained, shouting over the wind. I didn't expect the storm to hit so fast. James assessed the situation quickly. You won't make it back up the mountain in this. Come on, both of you. Emily hesitated only briefly before gathering her briefcase and Max's leash. The puppy bounded through the snow ahead of them, clearly delighted by this unexpected return to the farm. Inside, James built up the fire while Emily shed her wet coat. Max immediately claimed his old spot by the wood stove, making both humans smile despite themselves. Some things don't change, Emily said softly, watching the puppy settle onto the familiar blanket. Some things shouldn't. James spoke without thinking, then busied himself making coffee to cover his discomfort. The photo album still lay open on the table. Emily's eyes were drawn to it as she sat down, accepting the steaming mug James offered. "Your family?" James nodded, settling into the chair beside her. "Grandfather took most of these. He believed in documenting everything, said a farm's history was as important as its future." Emily turned a page carefully, revealing a photo of a young boy on a tractor. "Is this you?" "With my father." James's voice softened. "Summer of '85. First time he let me drive the old John Deere." Outside, the storm raged, but in the warm kitchen, something shifted as they bent over the album together. James found himself sharing stories. The year they rebuilt the barn after lightning struck it, the summer drought that taught him about perseverance, the day his grandfather showed him how to predict weather by watching the cattle. "He sounds remarkable," Emily said, studying a photo of the old man standing in wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. "He was." James touched the image gently. "Taught me everything I know about farming, about life, really." "What would he think?" Emily asked quietly. "About the investment fund?" James was silent for a long moment, watching the fire's reflection dance on the window glass. "He used to say a farmer's got to adapt or die. That pride's no good if it blinds you to necessary changes. But he also said never to trust anyone who hasn't worked the land themselves." He met her eyes. "No offense. None taken." Emily smiled slightly. "Though I might argue that different people work different kinds of fields. The power chose that moment to flicker and die, plunging them into firelight." Max whined softly until James lit the old kerosene lamp, its warm glow creating a bubble of intimacy around the kitchen table. "Tell me about your world," James said. Suddenly, "Help me understand." Emily stared into her coffee cup. "It's not as different as you might think. The same pressures to preserve legacy, to live up to expectations, just different fields, like I said. And are you happy in those fields?" The question surprised them both with its directness. Emily looked up, meeting James's steady gaze. Across the table, in the lamp's gentle light, all pretenses seemed to fall away. "I was running away," she admitted, "when I bought the house here. From expectations, from artificial relationships, from a world where everything has a price tag." She reached down to stroke Max's head. "Then this one showed me there are still genuine things in the world. And you—" She trailed off, but James felt the weight of what wasn't said. The storm howled outside, but in the kitchen's warm circle of light, surrounded by images of his family's history, something new was taking root, fragile as a spring seedling, but just as determined to grow. The torn check lay between them on James's kitchen table, ripped cleanly down the middle. Emily's signature was still visible on the bottom half, the amount enough to save the farm 3 times over. She stood by the window, arms crossed, while James remained at the table, his grandfather's watch clutched tight in his hand. "I was trying to help," Emily said, her voice tight with frustration. "The investment fund was taking too long, and the bank called you?" James's quiet tone carried more hurt than anger. "Behind my back, they called several potential investors. I just happened to be the only one who cared about keeping it a farm instead of turning it into a tech campus." Max paced between them, whining softly, picking up on the tension that filled the kitchen. Outside, spring was painting the valley, in tentative greens, but inside, winter's chill seemed to have returned. "I don't need to be rescued," James said finally. "Not by you, not by anyone. This isn't about rescue." Emily turned from the window, eyes bright with emotion. "This is about me watching someone I care about lose everything because he's too proud to accept help from someone who—" She stopped, abruptly. "Someone who what?" James stood, something shifting in his expression. "Someone who sees me as a charity case, a noble farmer who needs to be saved from himself? Someone who loves you, you impossible man!" The words hung in the air between them, shocking them both into silence. Max stopped pacing, looking between his 2 favorite humans with anxious attention. Emily recovered first, her face flushed. I didn't mean, I wasn't going to. How can you love me? James's voice was rough. We're from different worlds. You live in a mansion on the hill. I wake up at dawn to milk cows. You solve problems by writing checks. You solve them by risking your life to save helpless creatures. Emily stepped closer. By working 18-hour days to preserve something valuable. By being the most genuine person I've ever met. James looked down at the torn check, at his grandfather's watch, at the hands that were calloused from real work. I can't be what you need, he said quietly. What I need. Emily laughed, the sound caught between frustration and tenderness. What I need is someone who sees me, not my bank account. Someone who cares more about integrity than image. Someone who... She gestured around the kitchen, at the worn but well-loved furnishings. Someone who makes me feel more at home in a farmhouse kitchen than I ever felt in a penthouse. Emily... James's voice carried a warning, but he didn't step back when she moved closer. I'm not offering charity, she said softly. I'm offering partnership. In all ways, because somewhere between you saving Max and now, I realized that all my running away was really about running toward something. Toward this. Toward you. James closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the truth he heard in her voice. The watch in his hand ticked steadily as it had through 3 generations of Cooper farmers facing moments of choice. I can't let you give up your world, he said finally. I'm not giving up anything. I'm expanding my world to include what matters. Emily reached out, covering his hand and the watch with her own. Unless I'm wrong about how you feel. The moment stretched between them, filled with the weight of 2 different lives, 2 different worlds, balanced on the edge of becoming something new. Max pressed against their legs, offering silent support. James opened his eyes, looking at their joined hands, her manicured fingers over his work-roughened ones. You're not wrong, he said quietly, but I'm scared, Emily, not of losing the farm, but of losing myself, of becoming something I'm not. I don't want you to become anything else, Emily replied. I want you exactly as you are, stubborn, pride and all. Her lips curved slightly, though maybe with a little less resistance to accepting help from people who love you. The torn check seemed to mock them from the table, but somehow its importance had diminished. This wasn't about money anymore, if it ever truly had been. This was about 2 people who had found something real in a world of artificial connections, something worth the risk of bridging their different worlds. The partnership agreement looked different from the original investment fund contract. Spread across James's kitchen table, its pages reflected hours of careful negotiation, of finding middle ground between pride and practicality, between independence and connection. Emily sat beside him, Max dozing at their feet as they reviewed the final details. So the farm becomes a working education center, James said, tracing the words with his finger, teaching sustainable agriculture, traditional farming methods, while maintaining full operational independence, Emily added. The educational program generates income without compromising the farm's integrity, and my foundation's involvement is strictly administrative. James nodded slowly, feeling the rightness of it. This wasn't charity or rescue. It was evolution, a way to preserve what mattered while adapting to changing times. His grandfather would have understood. The summer programs for city kids, he mused, teaching them where food really comes from, how to work with animals, bridging worlds, Emily said softly, covering his hand with hers. Like we did. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the new growth in the fields beyond. Spring had arrived while they worked through their feelings, their fears, their future. The farm felt different now, not changed exactly, but expanded, as if it had taken a deep breath and grown to encompass new possibilities. I'll need help, James admitted, the words coming easier than he'd expected. Running educational programs isn't exactly my expertise. That's what partners are for. Emily squeezed his hand. I know people who've done similar programs in other states. And more importantly, I know you. You have a way of making people understand the value of this life. Max lifted his head, sensing the shift in energy. The puppy who had brought them together had grown a bit, just as their relationship had, becoming stronger and more sure with time. "What about your work?" James asked. "The foundation, the board. They'll adapt." Emily's voice held certainty. "Besides, I can run most of it from here. Modern technology does have its uses, even on a traditional farm." James smiled, remembering how she'd already set up a small office in his spare room, somehow making it fit without changing the farm's essential character. Like she fit, bringing new energy and ideas while respecting the core of what made this place special. "There will be challenges," he said, ever practical. "There already have been." Emily's eyes sparkled. "We managed wolves, storms, pride, prejudice. I think we can handle whatever comes next." James reached into his pocket, feeling his grandfather's watch. Its steady ticking had marked every major decision in his life, including this one. But for the first time, he truly understood what his grandfather had meant about adapting while staying true to oneself. "Partners, then," he said, picking up his pen. "In everything," Emily agreed softly. They signed together, their names side by side on the document that represented not just the farm's future, but their own. Max's tail thumped against the floor, offering canine approval of their decision. Outside, the spring morning continued to unfold. A tractor needed attention in the barn, and Emily had a conference call in an hour. Their worlds hadn't stopped being different, but they had found a way to create something new together, something that honored both their paths while blazing a trail forward. James stood, drawing Emily up with him. "Want to help me check the new calves before your call?" Her smile was answer enough. As they walked out into the morning, Max bounding ahead of them, James felt the lightness that comes with choosing love over fear, growth over stagnation. The farm stretched out before them, its fields rich with promise, ready for whatever future they would build together. The renovated barn stood as a testament to what was possible when old and new came together thoughtfully. Late summer sunshine streamed through the newly installed skylights, illuminating the preserved original beams alongside modern educational displays. James stood in the doorway watching as Emily arranged chairs for tomorrow's first official farm program orientation. 25 students, she said, checking her tablet, plus their parents. The waiting list for the next session is already full. Max lounged in a patch of sunlight, his golden fur catching the light. He'd appointed himself official greeter for the farm, equally comfortable with visiting children and newborn calves. The rope toy from his first stay still went everywhere, with him, now worn soft with love and use. "Did you ever imagine this?" James asked, gesturing at the transformed space. The barn still held hay and farm equipment, but now also featured a classroom area, interactive displays about sustainable agriculture, and a small office where Emily could manage her foundation work between farm duties. "Honestly, no." Emily set down her tablet, moving to stand beside him. "I was too busy running away from one life to imagine building another." She slipped her hand into his. "You changed that. You and this place." The past months had been a whirlwind of activity. Word of their educational program had spread quickly through Emily's network, attracting interest from schools, environmental groups, and families eager to connect their children with traditional farming. James found himself sharing his grandfather's wisdom with a new generation, watching young eyes light up as they learned where food really came from. "Cooper Family Farm and Education Center," he read from the new sign over the door. "Grandfather would never believe it." "I think he would," Emily disagreed gently. From what you've told me, he understood about evolution, about finding new ways to keep important things alive." They walked together through the barn, past the new milking parlor where students would learn hands-on farming skills, past the heritage seed display Emily had created, past the wall of family photos that now included recent additions. Emily learning to drive the tractor, James teaching her to milk cows, both of them laughing as Max herded sheep for the first time. Outside, the farm hummed with productive energy. Local teenagers helped with summer maintenance, earning both wages and practical experience. The farm store, Emily's latest project, sold organic produce and dairy products, alongside educational materials and locally made crafts. Even James's mother's old quilting table had found new life as the store's checkout counter. The North Field. "Irrigation is finished," James reported, consulting his own tablet, a concession to modern record-keeping that had proved surprisingly useful. Crop yield should increase by 30% next season, and the new cheese-making workshop is already booked through December, Emily added. She'd discovered a talent for combining business acumen with agricultural tradition, finding ways to make the farm both profitable and true to its roots. They paused by the paddock, where James still trained horses, another skill now shared with eager students. Max romped with the newest farm dog, a rescue that had shown up during spring planting, and never left. The sight of them playing made both humans smile, remembering the strange twist of fate that had brought them all together. "Claire called," Emily said after a moment. "The foundation board is impressed with the program's success. They want to use it as a model for other family farms." James squeezed her hand. "How does it feel, changing the world one farm at a time?" "Better than running from it." She leaned against him. "Though I have to admit, I never expected to find my purpose in a wolf rescue and a stubborn farmer." "Life's funny that way," James mused. "Sometimes the best things come from the worst storms." A school bus turned into their driveway, an advance visit from tomorrow's group. Max and his companion raced to greet it, tails wagging. James and Emily exchanged a look of shared purpose before moving to welcome their visitors. The farm had changed, yes, but its heart remained the same. The land still demanded respect and hard work. The animals still needed daily care. The seasons still dictated the rhythm of life. But now those eternal truths were being passed on, preserved not just through one family line, but through hundreds of young minds discovering the value of connection to the land, to tradition, and to each other. The hand-carved wedding ring caught the early morning light as Emily stood at the farmhouse window, watching James move through his daily routine. 1 year had passed since that stormy night when a frightened puppy had brought their worlds together. The ring, which James had carved from a piece of the old barn's heartpine, meant more to her than any diamond ever could. Max lay at her feet, grey starting to show around his muzzle, his rope toy still close at hand. Together, they watched James lead a group of students through the morning milking, his patience and knowledge transforming a simple farm task into something profound. "Ready for the foundation meeting?" James asked later, coming in from the barn. The smell of hay and honest work clung to him, mingling with the coffee Emily had brewing. Some things hadn't changed. He still rose before dawn, still worked the land with the same dedication his grandfather had shown, but other things had transformed in beautiful ways. The board's eager to hear about expanding the program, Emily replied, handing him a coffee mug. 3 more farms have applied for partnership status. James smiled, taking in the sight of her. She still dressed well, but now her clothes were practical, chosen for a life that balanced business calls with barn duties. The woman who had once hidden from the world now moved confidently between board meetings and farming workshops, equally at home in both. "Grandfather's watch stopped this morning," he said, pulling it from his pocket. "First time in 40 years. Emily took it gently, examining the worn case. "Maybe it's time to retire it, let it rest with the memories it's kept. Or maybe it's time to pass it on." James nodded toward the window, where their students were gathering for morning lessons. "These kids, they're the future of farming. Different from our time, but no less important." Max got up, sensing it was time for his morning rounds. The educational center had given him a new purpose. Part mascot, part therapy dog for stressed city kids experiencing farm life for the first time. He waited by the door, looking expectantly at his humans. They walked together through the transformed farm. The old buildings stood proudly alongside new additions. The learning center, the community gathering space, the small restaurant that served farm-to-table meals. Each addition had been carefully planned to enhance rather than replace the farm's original character. "Remember that first morning?" Emily asked, stopping by the spot where James had once treated Max's wounds. "I was so afraid you'd see me as just another rich person trying to throw money at problems. And I was afraid you'd see me as a charity case." James pulled her close. "We were both wrong. And both right in a way," Emily added. "We did need each other, just not in the ways we thought." They reached the newly restored North Field, where heritage wheat swayed in the morning breeze. The wolf pack that had once threatened Max was long gone, driven back to the mountains by development. But their passing had sparked something unexpected, a love story that had not only saved a family farm, but had created a new model for preserving agricultural traditions. Max barked suddenly, spotting the school bus approaching. Another day of teaching, learning, and growing was about to begin. Emily squeezed James's hand before heading to greet their visitors, her carved wooden ring catching the sunlight. James watched her go, thinking about circles and endings and new beginnings. The watch in his pocket might have stopped, but time moved forward, bringing changes that would have once seemed impossible. Love, he had learned, was like farming. It required faith, hard work, and the courage to adapt while holding on to what mattered most. "Come on, boy," he called to Max, who bounded to his side. Together they walked toward the future they had all built, one that had started with a storm, a rescue, and the simple truth that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as challenges, and the richest harvests grow from unexpected seeds.